Bibles, turn to John chapter 13 and Matthew chapter 27, or get your U version out and bring it up. Bring those up with that. We're going to talk about two bowls and two towels today. With that, it's a story about two men with two bowls and two towels, and the uniqueness of this is that they've happened within 24 hours of each other with that. But both have very different meanings and very different impact on our world, if you will. So let's take a look at John chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. 1 through 5. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he should depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During the supper, the devil, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, that he should come forth from God and was going back to God, he rose from supper and laid aside his garments, and taking the towel, he girded himself about. And then he poured water into the basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel which he was girded." There's very little doubt that Jesus here is trying to give one more lesson, one more bit of instruction to his disciples. He's simply showing them the truth of his own ministry and his own redemptive mercy. He shows them by doing this that he had come into what he had come into the world to do. You see, the parallel events that John records, he first of all talks about that Jesus rose up from the supper. Just as he had previously risen from the throne of glory, and then he laid aside his garments. And Paul tells us that he laid aside his glory when he came into this world. He laid aside his own deity. He didn't come to act as God. He came to act as a man indwelt by God. He girded himself with a towel. And just as Paul also records that he took the form of a servant and humbled himself and became obedient unto death on the cross. Here he humbled himself, taking on the role of a slave. The role that none of them were willing to do. He girded himself with the towel. And then he poured water into a basin. Just as in a few hours he was to pour out his own blood in death. The blood that would be the cleansing of human sin and human guilt of every kind and source. He pours out the water into that basin as a picture for that as he teaches his disciples another lesson. And then he began to wash the disciples' feet, to wipe them with the towel in which he was girded. Picturing the very act of applying the cleansing of his own blood to human lives. And if we skip to verse 12, we would see the end of this teaching session where it says that when he had washed their feet and taken his garments, he resumed his place. And just as the writer of Hebrews records for us that when he had made purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. So in these very few short verses, we have a remarkable, beautiful story worked out for us, teaching us the meaning of Jesus' whole ministry. A man and a bowl and a towel. Only a week before, Jesus had been in the home of Simon the leper for dinner. And you might remember the story. We walked a little bit through this here as we headed towards Easter. And that's when Mary, she brought that expensive perfume and she broke it and poured it out on Jesus' feet, and she wiped them with her hair and her tears. Remember, some of the disciples didn't understand. Matter of fact, they were a little angry for Mary wasting such expensive perfume that could have been sold and helped out the poor, remember? At least that was Judas's statement. And she called him the Messiah. But you know, she was really just preparing him for his burial. The next day was when Jesus rode into Jerusalem. And people put down the palm leaves and basically gave praise to him. They praised him and called him the Messiah. The next day that he cursed a fig tree because it didn't bear fruit. The next day he was in the temple. Remember, he was going to the temple teaching, and they were trying to trick him, but it never worked. He was too wise for that. It was during that time that a widow brought a small offering that she had. It's all she had. Jesus said it was worth more than all the others because she had given everything. Much like he had done and was about to do on the cross. That same night was when Judas went before the Sanhedrin and he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. The next day, Jesus and the disciples spent the day resting in Bethany, and it was the following day, that Thursday, that he ate the Passover with his disciples. And it was during that meal that we read about it here in John. When Jesus rose up and began to wash the disciples' feet, did you notice that he didn't wash the feet, just the feet of James and John, who were a couple of his favorites, his buds, his favorites? And even though they were the two of the ones that were closest to him, he went to Judas, the one he already knew had sold him out. He went to Peter, who he already knew was going to deny him 3 times that very night. And he washed their feet. He took the bowl, he took the water, he took the towel, and he began to wash their feet. The Most High had taken the role of the lowest slave and servant and began washing their feet. Imagine with me, could you put yourself in that situation? Jesus, God's only Son, kneels down before you to wash your feet. And he was trying to show us something, just as he was his disciples. We are to serve one another. We are to serve one another. And I wish I could tell you that it changed those disciples' lives. They immediately had an epiphany, and that they were never quite the same. You know, Jesus goes on to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray because he's hurting. He knows what's about to take place. So he took along with him some of those very guys that he had washed their feet, and he asked them to wait and pray with him. And he went a little further and he prayed, and when he returned, the disciples were asleep. Not once, not twice, but 3 times he went back and they were asleep. You see, God himself became a servant for them, yet they couldn't do a simple little thing for him. You realize that Jesus got up. He took the bowl, he took the towel, he took the water, and he washed their feet. Now, think about this. It's in the middle of the meal. Why? Why did Jesus have to get up and do that? Jesus wasn't washing clean feet. Not at all. You see, they had come into the meal, and if there was a servant, that servant would have washed their feet as they came in to recline at the table. But there wasn't. And maybe you remember the argument that the disciples were having before this took place. They were discussing who was the more important one. And of course, the more important one wasn't going to say, oh, hey, why don't we stop here? I'll wash your feet. Jesus took the bowl, he took the towel, he took the water, and he washed their feet. He took the beatings, he took the cross, he took the pain, and he died for us. You would think that we could do a simple thing for him. And yet too often he returns to find us like the disciples, asleep. It was that very night that they came for Jesus and they arrested him. One of the very men that he had knelt down before and washed his feet had sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. And he took Jesus before both the religious and civil authorities that night and had court, even though it was illegal. And that next morning is when they brought him before Pilate. Enter the second bowl. But Pilate saw no crime. Matthew 27. And he sent him to Herod, and he mocked him and sent him back to Pilate. And Pilate had hoped that the crowds would allow him to release Jesus. They had a deal that they would release one prisoner. So Pilate picked one. He picked the worst that he could think of, Barabbas, who was a murderer and a thief, thinking surely they wouldn't let him go. But they did. They shouted, "Crucify Jesus." Let's enter Pilate here in verse 19 of chapter 27 in Matthew. It says, and while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife, Pilate, sent to him, saying, have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him. Now that's rather interesting, isn't it? Makes you want to know a little bit about the dream. Pilate's wife, sleeping, has this dream. Notice how she calls him a righteous man. And says, but I've suffered greatly in a dream, so don't touch him. It says, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitudes to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But Pilate, the governor, answered and said to them, which of the two do you want me to release to you? And they said, Barabbas. And Pilate asked them again, then what shall I do with Jesus, who's called Christ? And they said, crucify him. Let him be crucified. And he said, why? What evil has he done? But they kept shouting all the more, crucify him, crucify him. The crowd is getting loud and violent. And when Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, verse 24 says, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the multitude, saying, I am innocent of this man's blood. See that to yourselves. You see, Pilate, he knew what was right. He even made an effort to save Jesus. He made that effort. Hey, let's try this Barabbas thing. Certainly, they will understand you don't want Barabbas back in the crowd. Let Jesus go. He's done nothing. He knew that. But he was more worried about how he would look.